On September 18, 1975, the main surviving members of the SLA, Emily and Will Harris, were arrested. However, all the attention was not on them but on Patty Hearst, the kidnapping victim who had turned into a determined radical criminal. What punishment would she receive? Would the trial be fair, or would the influence of the Hearst family prevail over the law? The road to the trial was still long. The main charge against Patty was the robbery of the Hibernian Bank, the very one that had once shocked America. It is worth noting that she was the only member of the SLA charged for this, as Emily and Will did not participate in the robbery, and the other robbers had died on May 17, 1974, in Los Angeles. Of course, Randolph Hearst hired the best lawyers for his daughter. One of them, by the way, was Lee Bailey, the lawyer who later kept O.J. Simpson out of prison. It seemed like a hopeless situation, but what could the lawyers propose? The video did not allow them to use classic defense strategies in such cases, like she was not actually in the bank, or it wasn't her. No, the video did not give the defense such avenues of retreat. Essentially, there was only one possible line of defense: to insist that Patty, as they say, had her mind washed or, in legal terms, was coerced into doing certain actions. However, the first problem for the defense was to convince not the jurors, but Patty herself. After all, she continued to express revolutionary sentiments in every way. This was evident in her words, her gestures, and her letters to her boyfriend, also arrested, Stephen Solia. In them, she wrote that she continued to love him, that she was still the same revolutionary, that she wanted to overthrow the American government. Of course, with such an attitude from Patty herself, the lawyer's work was meaningless. Therefore, as already mentioned, the main thing was to return her to the state of a year and a half ago, to convince her that the people who kidnapped her were not her friends at all, that they only harmed her. Patty spent many days with the lawyer and psychologists up until January 15, 1976, the day of the first court hearing. High heels, perfect pedicure, very expensive clothes. This was the world that saw Patty Hearst in court. She was the complete opposite of the arrested, revolutionarily minded girl. This was an incredibly difficult case for the defense. It was obvious that if this girl had not been kidnapped, she would never have become a robber. But the mere fact of the kidnapping did not play any role. It was necessary to prove that she was forced into this crime. However, the problem was that all of Patty's actions after the robbery spoke to the contrary: shooting at the sports goods store, participating in the explosions of police cars. Repeatedly, she was alone. Why didn't she run away? Undoubtedly, in this case, all the aces were in the hands of the prosecution. The defense brought in psychologists who specialized in suggestion. Thus, the defense managed to obtain a document stating that Patty had developed the so-called Stockholm Syndrome. To elaborate, in psychology, Stockholm Syndrome refers to a certain unconscious traumatic bond that arises between a victim and their aggressor. Under the influence of strong emotional distress, hostages begin to sympathize with their captors. If we digress a bit, it is worth mentioning that this term was first used during a bank hostage situation, as one might guess, in Stockholm. At that time, a recently released prisoner took hostages in a bank. He had 4 hostages with whom he spent 5 days in the bank. On the 5th day, the police conducted a gas attack. After that, the criminal surrendered, and the hostages came out of the bank unharmed. Later, they stated that they were afraid not of the captor himself, but of the police actions. According to some reports, they even hired a lawyer for the criminal. Returning to the case of Patty Hearst, the prosecution countered the defense's arguments by stating that none of the SLA members had any special knowledge in the field of mind control. None of them had education close to this. As for Stockholm Syndrome, the prosecutor asked the defense psychologist a question. Can you provide even one example where a victim of Stockholm Syndrome not only expressed sympathy for the criminal, but also committed a crime themselves? Of course, the answer was no. The testimonies of Emily and Will Harris did not contradict the words of Patty's lawyer. Yes, we kidnapped her. Yes, we kept her in the closet. But when Patty herself started to speak, she said something that caused wild anger in her former comrades. In the second part of this story, before the cheap account of what happened in the SLA apartment during the kidnapping, I mentioned that the situation was described from the words of one of the participants in those events. So, this participant was Will Harris. When Patty herself spoke about these events, she said that she had been raped first by Willie Wolfe and then by Donald DeFreeze. This was the very point at which Patty's and the Harris's testimonies diverged in different directions.
The idea that these women would allow Patricia Hearst, no matter what her situation, to be raped by men in the group is really ludicrous. It offends me.
No one raped Patricia Hearst, ever. If somebody had sexually assaulted Hearst, someone among us would have probably shot them.
Who to believe in this situation, everyone decides for themselves. But it should not be forgotten that most of the group were women with feminist views. These were strong women in every sense. It is hard to imagine that they would allow such a thing. Also, one can recall Patty's own words about Willie Wolfe.
Cujo was the gentlest, most beautiful man I've ever known. He taught me the truth as he learned it from the beautiful brothers in California's concentration camps. Neither Cujo or I had ever loved an individual the way we loved each other. Our relationship's foundation was our commitment to the struggle and our love for the people.
Before this confession, Emily and Will somewhat supported the line of defense for Patty Hearst, but the words about the rape burned all the bridges between them. Moreover, Emily Harris gave the prosecutor very important information. Patty carried an amulet with her until the moment of her arrest, the one that Willie Wolfe had once given her. It was even part of the amulet. The second part was found under Wolfe's burned body. Obviously, no woman would cherish a gift from her rapist. Of course, this gift meant something to her, and it certainly was not a memory of the rape. It was important for the defense that Patty would come to the stand and tell herself about how she was frightened in captivity, about the 8 weeks in the closet, about the threats of rape, and the like. The lawyers managed to convince her to do this, but it was at this moment that the defense opened a real Pandora's box. Now, having come to the stand, Patty, in addition to giving testimony, had to answer the prosecutor's questions. The case under consideration concerned only one robbery, the robbery of the Hibernia Bank, the one in which Patty was caught on tape. The defense was sure that questions not related to this crime would be cut off by the judge. But no, the prosecutor asked questions about what happened afterward, about the shooting at the sports goods store, about why she did not escape, about her participation in the robbery of the second bank, the Crocker Bank. Yes, this indeed did not relate to the case under consideration, but, as already mentioned, the defense needed to prove that Patty was forced to rob the bank. The prosecution, however, showed that all of Patty's actions during the robbery and over the following 18 months spoke to the contrary, that she voluntarily followed the SLA members, actively participated in their plans, and even took part in their implementation. The prosecutor asked these 42 questions, and the answer to each of them was, "I refuse to answer." She had every right to do so. This right was given to her by the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But how did this look in the eyes of the jurors? It was obvious that such answers from Patty were only an additional confirmation that she had something to hide. March 19, 1976, was the last day of the trial, the day when the jury had to make the final decision on the guilt or innocence of Patty Hearst. The verdict was guilty. The jury recommended that Patty be given the maximum sentence of 35 years. Later, this term was reduced by the judge to 7 years.
Everything went pretty much the way the SLA said it would go. I was arrested. I was brought to trial, convicted. Seems like everything the SLA told me would happen has happened.
Of course, in the shortest possible time, Patty's lawyers filed an appeal. It is incredibly rare in such cases for the accused to be released on bail pending the appeal. This case was one of those. Pending the appeal, Patty Hearst was released on a $1 million bail. There were 2 conditions set by the judge pending the appeal. Patty had to live in her parents' house. and the second condition was that the costs of her security were fully covered by the Hearst family. Patty's lawyer, Tig, told the police chief that he recommended several people for security, one of whom was Bernie Shaw. He was chosen as Patty's bodyguard during her time of freedom. At the time Patty and Bernie Shaw met, she was 22 and he was 31. Bernie Shaw had a wife and a child at that time. However, this did not prevent their romance from flourishing, and they began a relationship which, of course, became the downfall of Bernie Shaw's family. One way or another, Patty awaited the appeal hearing in her parents' house. But the trial we have already considered was not the only one. Above, we have already talked about the trial of Patty Hearst in the bank robbery case. This trial took place in San Francisco. In addition, in Los Angeles, she was also charged with a crime, namely the robbery of a sports goods store and reckless handling of a weapon. This refers to the case mentioned earlier when, on May 16, 1974, Will and Emily Harris were detained by the store security. In response, gunfire was opened at the store, thereby scaring off the guards. The trial on this case lasted about 6 months. The practice of such cases suggested that the sentence should have been about 15 years in prison. But Patty, apparently going for a deal with the prosecution, did not deny her guilt and received only 5 years. This is conditional against the backdrop of the charges against Patty Hearst. The trials of Emily and Will Harris went almost unnoticed. They were charged with the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. This could have ended in a life sentence. But their involvement in the kidnapping still needed to be proven. In the end, they both agreed to a deal with the prosecutor. They pleaded guilty in exchange for 11 years in prison. Considering the time they had already spent behind bars, they were both released early, Will in 1983 and Emily in 1984. In 1986, they divorced and their paths diverged. But in the lives of Patty, Emily, Will, and other members of the SLA, there was another crime, that very second bank robbery, during which a woman was killed. Despite the fact that Patty Hearst was a participant in this crime, even if only as the driver of the car on which the group left the bank, under the law, this made her an equal participant in the robbery and murder. However, the FBI made her a unique offer to tell everything she knew about this case in exchange for immunity. In other words, in exchange for the fact that she would never be prosecuted as an accomplice to the robbery and murder. One could speculate at length about the role of the Hearst family's influence in this, but nevertheless, that was exactly how it was. Of course, it would have been foolish not to accept such an offer. Therefore, Patty told everything she knew about this crime. That Emily Harris, Kathleen Solia, Jim Kilgore, and Michael Borton were in the bank. That Emily Harris was the one who pulled the trigger. That Emily's husband, Will, also participated in this matter as a backup driver, and a bunch of other minor details. However, the problem was that one of the hostages in the bank pointed to Stephen Solia as a participant in the robbery, the very guy with whom Patty had a relationship before the arrest. However, Patty herself in her testimony said that Stephen was not in the bank, that he did not participate in this matter at all. In the end, the prosecutor who led this case did not take Patty Hearst's testimony into account, as it went against the line of prosecution. The prosecution of Stephen Solia, one way or another, Patty received the promised immunity. Stephen Solia, by the way, was acquitted in this case and was no longer prosecuted by the court. Returning to Patty Hearst, it should be reminded that she was awaiting an appeal in the case of the robbery of the first bank, the one where she was caught on video. The appeal was denied. The judge left the sentence in force, 7 years of imprisonment. She had to return to prison, but instead of 7 years, she served only 2, as President Carter softened her sentence.
Well, this is quite a difference from last time, and thank you all. And I'm really happy to be going home. There it is. The commutation. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Two months after her release from prison, Patty Hearst married Bernie Shaw, the policeman who had been her bodyguard. With him, Patty had 2 children, 2 girls. It can be said that after her release from prison, Patty Hearst began to live the life she was supposed to live as the daughter of a media magnate. She often appeared on TV, gave numerous interviews, participated in fashion shows, and starred in several films. Probably, this was how she saw her life before the kidnapping. There were many articles about her in the press, most of them focused on her as a kidnapping victim, not as a member of the SLA group. Probably, the money and influence of Patty's father did their part. In the end, they completely whitewashed her daughter in the eyes of society. In 1981, she released a book titled Every Secret Thing. Later, Patty's former lawyer said that the release of this book was the stupidest thing he had ever seen. Why so? Because in the book, Patty indeed described her involvement in the robberies of the Hibernia and Crocker banks, even though she had a promise from the FBI that she would not be prosecuted for the murder of Myrna Upsall. But did this give Patty the right to openly tell the whole world that she was involved in this crime? Because of the book, she was again threatened with prosecution, but it never came to that. In 2001, President Bill Clinton finally commuted Patty Hearst's sentence. It is interesting to note that this happened on Clinton's last day as president. The story could have ended here, but no.
At 8:21 this morning, members of the Minnesota Fugitive Task Force arrested Sarah Jane Olson, whom we believe to be longtime Symbionese Liberation Army fugitive Kathleen Ann Celia.
On June 16, 1999, a new twist occurred in her story. On June 16, 1999, Kathleen Celia was arrested under the name Sarah Olson. She had been hiding for a full 23 years. Her story deserves a separate video, but to summarize briefly, the FBI, having conducted a search in the house where Will and Emily Harris lived, found weapons and components similar to those used to make the bombs that the SLA placed under police cars. According to the FBI, Kathleen Celia also lived in this house with Will and Emily. A large number of her fingerprints were found in the house, especially on the components for homemade bombs. A local store clerk remembered how Kathleen Celia bought metal pipes from him, similar to those used to make the bomb casings. Near one of the places where a bomb was found, Kathleen Celia was caught on video in March 1976. Kathleen Celia was charged with possession of explosive substances and attempted murder. However, by this time, Kathleen had already fled. She escaped from California to Minnesota. There, she changed her name to Sarah Olson. She was about 30 years old at the time. Most likely, this choice of surname was justified by the fact that it was the most popular surname in Minnesota. Probably, this made the search for Kathleen even more complicated. Already there, in Minnesota, Kathleen Celia, having the new name Sarah Olson, married a doctor named Gerard Peterson. In her marriage, she gave birth to 3 daughters. Kathleen and her husband spent some time in Africa. There, Kathleen's husband worked in a medical missionary group. When they returned to America, they settled in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. There, Kathleen returned to her long-forgotten acting career. She was very active in the social life of the city. She read newspapers for the blind, helped victims of domestic violence, and organized food distribution for the needy. Of course, none of her new acquaintances, including her husband, had any idea about this woman's past life. It can probably be said that she had become a completely different person. For 23 years, she managed to hide, but everything changed because of television. On May 15, 1999, a photo of Kathleen Celia was shown on the program America's Most Wanted, and already on June 16, a month after that, she was arrested. It is not reported how the FBI tracked her down, but it seems that the TV show played a significant role in this. In preparation for the trial, Kathleen Celia, now officially having changed her name to Sarah Olson, made a deal with the prosecutor. She pleaded guilty to storing explosive substances and attempted murder. This refers to the murder of police officers during planned terrorist attacks. For this, Kathleen Celia was sentenced to 14 years in prison. However, that was not all. After the sentencing, the California Prosecutor's Office announced that it was resuming the case of the 1975 bank robbery in which Kathleen Celia and other members of the SLA had participated. At that time, many were surprised that the murder of Myrna Upsall, the woman killed in the bank was still considered unsolved. The police, let alone the entire America, thanks to Patty Hearst's book, knew who was guilty of this crime: Emily Harris, Jim Kilgore, Kathleen Solia, Will Harris, Michael Borton, and Patty Hearst. As we already know, Patty Hearst received immunity in exchange for her testimony in this case. The other 5 were brought to trial. By this time, Will Harris already had a family and children. Emily Harris worked as a programmer and founded her own company. Michael Borton was married to Josephine Solia, Catherine's younger sister. Kathleen Solia herself has already been mentioned above. The last one, Jim Kilgore, was still on the run. He was charged in absentia. During the long court proceedings, all the defendants pleaded guilty in the case of the murder of Myrna Opsahl. The confession was part of a deal with the prosecutor. In exchange for the confession, the defendants received sentences much shorter than the law stipulated. Michael Borton was sentenced to 6 years in prison, Will Harris to 7, Emily Harris to 8, Kathleen Solia, who was on the run, and Jim Kilgore to 7. At that time, he was the only member of the SLA who had not spent a single day in prison. However, almost 30 years later, he was finally caught. He was arrested in South Africa. While on the run, Kilgore took the name Charles Spencer. For a long time, he worked as a teacher in Zimbabwe and South Africa. During this period, he got married and had 2 children. He also earned a doctorate. Under his assumed name, he wrote many dissertations and also taught at educational institutions in South Africa until he was arrested in 2002. In summary, we can remember all the members of the significant American group SLA: Donald DeFries, Mismoon Soltysik, Angela Atwood, Willie Wolfe, Camilla Hall, and Nancy Perry died during the shootout and fire in 1974 in Los Angeles. Russell Little, one of the 2 arrested members of the SLA, who was intended to be exchanged for Patty Hearst, was convicted of the murder of Marcus Foster. He served 7 years in prison, after which his case was reviewed, and in 1987 he was released. After that, he moved to Hawaii, where he started a family. The second member of the SLA, who was intended for the exchange, Joe Ramiro, was also convicted of the murder of Marcus Foster. However, he received a life sentence. Probably, the difference was that he was found with the same revolver that was used to kill Foster. Joe Ramiro is still in prison. Will Harris served 8 years in prison for the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. In 1983, he was released. He became a private detective and remarried. In his marriage, he had 2 sons. In 2002, he was convicted of the murder of Myrna Opsahl. After 4 years, he was released early. Emily Harris served 9 years in prison for the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. In 1984, she was released. In prison, she actively studied programming, which helped her found her own computer company. In 2002, she was convicted of the murder of Myrna Opsahl. After 5 years, she was released early. Michael Borton was convicted in 2002 of the murder of Myrna Opsahl. He was released after 4 years in 2006. By this time, he was married to Josephine Solia, also a member of the SLA, but she was the only one who was never charged. Jim Kilgore was convicted in 2002 of the murder of Myrna Opsahl. In the same year, he was caught in South Africa. He served 7 years in prison and was released in 2009. During his imprisonment, he wrote several novels. After his release, he moved with his family to Bolivia, where he worked as a teacher at a local university. Wendy Yoshimura was convicted of possessing explosive substances and weapons. She served 5 years in prison and was released in 1980. After her release from prison, she became an artist. Steve Solia was not convicted in any of the group's cases. He worked as a painter all his life. In 2013, he died of cancer. Kathleen Solia, now Sarah Olson, hid for 23 years and was caught in 1999. She was sentenced to 14 years for possessing explosive substances and attempted murder, as well as 7 years for the murder of Myrna Opsahl. On March 17, 2008, she was released early. However, 5 days later, she was arrested again because she was mistakenly released from prison a year earlier than her term. Ultimately, in 2009, Kathleen Solia was finally released. She returned to her family in Minnesota. One of her daughters, Sophia Chalet, was a participant in the popular American show American Idol. There are many videos of her performances on YouTube. Without exaggeration, it can be said that the story of the SLA is one of the brightest criminal stories of the 20th century. The group existed for only 2 years, but these 2 years were filled with events that lasted for decades. The SLA can be viewed differently depending on how you feel about crimes committed for a noble cause. But undoubtedly, the story of the SLA is unlikely to leave anyone indifferent.